Hello and welcome back. In this lecture we'll create our first service. So far we wrote two components, that is visual components, that are displayed on the page. Services, on the other hand, only contain data and logic. They're not things that we want to display on the page. For this step, we won't add any new functionality to our application. Instead, we'll extract the functionality that has to do with generating a random quote from the random quote component into a separate service called quote service. This is partly as an exercise, but also because it's a good practice. Components are responsible for displaying things. All the other logic is best kept in services. So let's create this service called quote service. Now, how do we create a service? Well, a service is basically just a class, and we can create one using the ng.core.class utility method that we're going to import at the top as our usual. So quote service is a class, and like all classes has a constructor. In the constructor, we can initialize a quotes property that in this case is just an alias for the quotes array that we have at the bottom of this file. Let's rename this array to sample quotes, just to make it clear that it's just some sample data. So this .quotes is just a reference to sample quotes in this example, but in a real application we could be getting this data by making an HTTP request instead. So in general, we want to keep the data inside the service. Next, we want a method called getRandomQuote that needs to do pretty much what we are currently doing in the random quote component, that is generating a random index and then returning the item of the quotes array at that random index. So that's our service. That's all there is to it. It's just a class. Now, how do we use this service in our random quote component? Well, a simple option would be to create a new instance of this class in the component's constructor. So here we can add a variable called quote service and set it to a new quote service. Then we can use it by calling quote service getRandomQuote. And this approach works fine in this case. We can try and refresh the page and everything still works. However, that's not how we typically use services in Angular, because Angular is designed to manage all these dependencies between components and services for us. So what we want to do is change our constructor to accept the quote service as a parameter. This way, quote service will be passed in or injected by Angular. Now, this won't work yet, but let's see what happens anyway. There you go, it's not loading anymore. Let's open the Chrome Developer Tools and we can see an error saying can't resolve all parameters for class 1. Now this is a bit of a strange message. What is this class 1? Turns out when using Angular with ES5 JavaScript, if we want better error messages, we need to name our constructor functions. Otherwise, Angular just generates names like class 1 that are not very helpful for debugging. Right now, this constructor is an anonymous function that we assign to the constructor property of the object that we pass to the class method. We can name this function and give it the same name as the class, that is random quote component. If we refresh the page now, we can see that the error says can't resolve all parameters for random quote component. So at least it's telling us which class has the problem. Therefore, it's a good idea to name all our constructor functions. Let's do the same for quote service and for app component as well. Now back to the error, can't resolve all parameters for random quote component. This means that Angular noticed that our random quote component has a parameter, but it doesn't know what kind of service should be passed as the argument. We need to help Angular by telling it the type, that is the class of the parameter. To do this in ES5 JavaScript, Angular supports a special way of creating the constructor, where the constructor property is an array and the last item of the array is the actual function we already have. while the first items of the array specify the types of the parameters we're expecting in the constructor. In this case, we want to pass quote service as the first item. If we had more parameters, like quote service A and B, for example, we would pass their types as the first three items in the array in the same order as they appear in the constructor. But we only have one service at the moment, of course, so let me remove A and B. Right, so let's try running our app again. We're getting a different error now. If we scroll up, the exception says no provider for quote service. This means that Angular now knows that random quote component needs a quote service, but it doesn't know how to provide a quote service. So the last step we need is to tell Angular how to create our service. We can do that by using another metadata property called providers that we can add to our app module. Providers is an array, and in this case we need a single service that is quote service. So let's reload our app, and yay, it's working again. Now, by declaring the quote service provider in the app module, Angular will create a single instance of quote service shared across our whole application, and that's usually the right thing to do for most services. But it's not the only option. If we wanted to, we could declare the quote service provider in random quote component instead, since that's the component that uses quote service. And this would also work, as you can see if we reload the app. So what's the difference between providing a service at the component level and doing it at the module level? Well, if we do it at the component level, Angular will create a new instance of the service for each instance of this component. Let me show you what this means. Let's add a variable here called quote service ID that we'll use to identify each instance of our service. And in the quote service constructor, let's set an ID property to quote service ID, incrementing the value of quote service ID afterwards. So this way, the first instance that gets created will have ID 1, the second instance will get ID 2, and so on. Now, when the getRandomQuote method is called, let's log a message saying using quote service and the ID. Finally, in the app components template, let's display 2 random quotes instead of 1. Let's see what happens now. So we see 2 quotes on the page, and in the console we see using quote service 1 and then using quote service 2. That means that when Angular encountered our first random quote tag, it created a new instance of random quote component, and it also created a first instance of the quote service, injecting it into the random quote component constructor. When it got to the second random quote tag, it did the same thing all over again. That is, it created a new instance of random quote component and a new instance of quote service as well. That's the quote service 2 we see in the console. So since quote service is declared in the providers of this component, each instance of the component will create a new instance of the service as well. If we move the providers declaration back to the module instead and reload the page, we still see 2 quotes, but we can see in the console that it's always using quote service 1. So it's creating a single instance of the quote service and passing that same instance to both random quote component instances. Again, declaring services at the module level is usually what we want, especially if a service contains some data that we want to share across different components. So unless you specifically want to create a separate service for each component for some reason, just declare all your services at the module level. Right, let's remove this quote service ID stuff now. And the logging, check that the app still works. We don't need 2 quotes either. Try again. Good. So in this lecture, we've created our first service. That's pretty simple because it's basically just a class. But then we've seen how to use a service in a component. We typically want to declare services as parameters in our constructor function so that Angular will inject them into our component. However, we also need to tell Angular the parameter types, and we can do that by turning the constructor into an array where the first items specify the classes of the parameters. Finally, we need to add the provider's metadata property listing all the services we need, and we usually want to do that in our app module. So Angular will create a single instance of each service shared across our whole application. In the next lecture, we'll talk a bit more about dependency injection. That is pretty much what we just seen, but it is such a central concept in Angular that it deserves some extra attention. I'll see you later.